Story 1. The Haunted Mirror. It was New Year's Eve, and I was 12 years old. My parents were out for the evening, celebrating with friends in a nearby town. That left me at my friend's house, an old, isolated place surrounded by tall trees that seemed to swallow all the light from the sky. Just getting to the house was unsettling. The long, overgrown path felt like it stretched forever, each step pulling you deeper into the shadows. The house itself looked ancient, almost like something out of an old ghost story. Its windows were tall and narrow, staring down like eyes, and the wooden walls creaked even when there was no hot wind. Some kids at school said the place was haunted. They claimed it was even mentioned in a book about local ghost stories. I always thought they were exaggerating, but standing there that night, I wasn't so too sure. Inside, the atmosphere wasn't much better. The furniture was old, the walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and the dim light barely reached the corners of the rooms. It felt like the house was alive, watching us. But we tried not to think about it. My friend and I sat in the living room, flipping through TV channels, trying to make the place feel less creepy. For a while, it worked. We laughed at a silly show, and for a moment, I almost forgot about the house's eerie reputation. But deep down, something felt off. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel right, like the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't realize it then, but that night would change how I felt about the dark forever. We were sitting on the worn-out couch, lost in the glow of the TV when it happened. A loud crashing sound shattered the silence, echoing through the house like an explosion. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, the sound still ringing in my ears. I looked at my friend, and his wide, panicked eyes told me he'd heard it too. Neither of us moved for a moment, the air heavy with tension. "What was that?" I finally whispered, my voice shaky. My friend didn't answer. He just stood there staring at the hallway that led deeper into the house. It was as if he was too scared to even think about what could have made the noise. I wasn't much braver. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Maybe something fell. Maybe the wind knocked something over. But there was no wind tonight, and the crash sounded far too loud for something simple. The house seemed even darker now, as if the sound had sucked the little warmth out of the room. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath us felt louder, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. "Should we check it out?" I asked hesitantly, not sure if I wanted to hear the answer. My friend nodded, though he looked as pale as I felt. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared, really scared. Whatever made that sound wasn't normal, and deep down, we both knew it. Still, we couldn't ignore it. Slowly, we stood up, our footsteps hesitant as we stepped into the shadowy hallway. Every instinct in my body told me to turn back. But something else, curiosity maybe, or just plenty fear of looking like a coward, pushed me forward. The crashing noise had come from somewhere upstairs, and as much as I didn't want to go there, I knew we had to. We crept down the hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath our feet. The light from the living room grew dimmer with every step, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of the house. The air felt colder now, almost icy, as if someone had left a window wide open. I rubbed my arms to stay warm, but the chill seemed to seep right into my skin. As we reached the base of the staircase, we stopped. Neither of us wanted to go up, but the crashing noise still echoed in our minds, urging us forward. "You go first," my friend whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head. "No way," I whispered back. After a few moments of silent debate, we decided to go together, step by step, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The staircase groaned with each step, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. When we reached the top, the freezing air hit us even harder. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, like stepping into a freezer. My breath came out in small, visible puffs, and I could tell my friend felt it too. His face was pale, and he kept glancing around nervously. The hallway stretched out in front of us, long and dark, with doors on either side. At the far end, one door stood slightly open, swaying just enough to make a faint creaking sound. That was where the noise had come from. We looked at each other, both too scared to speak. The door seemed to beckon us, daring us to come closer. Slowly, we started walking toward it, our footsteps hesitant and quiet. The cold breeze seemed to grow stronger the closer we got, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to run back downstairs and wait for our parents to come home. But something kept me moving forward, step by step, until we were standing just a few feet away from the door. It was moving back and forth ever so slightly, creaking softly with each swing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as my friend reached out, his hand trembling, and gently pushed the door open. What we saw inside made us both freeze in place, unable to breathe or move. The door creaked open, revealing a room cloaked in darkness. The faint moonlight from the windows cast long, eerie shadows across the walls. My friend stepped inside first, his body disappearing into the shadows as if the darkness had swallowed him whole. I hesitated at the doorway, my legs refusing to move. "What do you see?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. For a moment, there was nothing, just an oppressive silence so thick it made my ears ring. Then, suddenly, my friend screamed. It wasn't just a startled yell, it was a raw, terrified scream that sent chills down my spine. I bolted into the room without thinking, my heart racing. The air inside was freezing, colder than anything I'd ever felt. I fumbled along the wall, my fingers desperately searching for the light switch. When I found it and flipped it on, the dim yellow light revealed a scene that made my blood run cold. The antique mirror that had hung on the far wall was shattered, its glass scattered across the floor in jagged, glittering pieces. My friend stood frozen in the middle of the room, his face pale as a ghost. His eyes were wide, staring unblinkingly at an empty corner of the room. I called his name, my voice shaking, but he didn't respond. I stepped carefully around the shards of glass and placed a hand on his shoulder. His skin was ice cold, and he flinched at my touch as if he hadn't even realized I was there. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He finally turned to look at me, his lips trembling. "She broke the mirror," he whispered, his voice shaky and uneven. My stomach dropped. "Who?" I asked, dread creeping into my voice. He pointed to the empty corner of the room. "The woman in the corner," he said, barely audible. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just shadows. The room was still and silent, but his fear was so real, so raw that I couldn't brush it off. My legs felt like they would give out beneath me. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this room as possible. "Let's go," I said, tugging at his arm. He didn't resist, and we carefully made our way out of the room, avoiding the shards of glass on the floor. But as we left, couldn't help myself. I turned back to look at the mirror, lying face down on the floor. Something didn't feel right. I bent down and carefully flipped the mirror over. To my shock, the string that had held it to the wall was perfectly intact, as was the nail it hung from. The mirror hadn't just fallen, it had been lifted off the hook. My chest tightened as I stared at it, a cold realization settling over me. Someone, or something, had done this, and it was still out there. We hurried down the hallway, our footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. Neither of us said a word. The weight of what had just happened was too much to process. When we finally reached the living room, the warm and light felt almost comforting, but it couldn't shake the chill that clung to us. My friend grabbed his phone with trembling hands and called his parents, his voice shaking as he told them to come home immediately. We waited by the front door, not daring to go back into the house. The cold breeze from upstairs still seemed to linger, wrapping around us even as we stood there. Every creak of the old house made me jump, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. Who was the woman? Why was she in the room? And how had the mirror fallen when everything else, the string, the nail, was still perfectly in place? When our parents finally returned, their arrival brought a brief sense of relief. My dad and my friend's dad immediately went upstairs to check the room, while my mom stayed with us trying to calm us down. We told them about the mirror, about the cold, about the woman in the corner, but when they came back down, they didn't look convinced. "The mirror's broken, but it's just an old piece of furniture," my dad said. "You kids were probably just playing around, and it fell." His words felt like a dismissal, like he wasn't even trying to believe us. My friend's dad nodded in agreement, adding, "It's a big old house. Strange things happen sometimes. Don't let your imaginations run wild." I wanted to argue, to make them understand that this wasn't just our imaginations, but I could see it in their face. They thought we were just two scared kids making up ghost stories. So I stayed quiet, the fear bubbling inside me as I glanced at my friend. His pale face and haunted eyes told me he felt the same way I did. This wasn't over. That night, as I lay in bed in my own house, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the corner. My friend had seen her. He wasn't the type to make things up, especially not something like this. And the mirror, it hadn't just fallen. Someone had lifted it, deliberately pulled it off the wall. I knew it in my gut. But if no one else believed us, what could we do? The only thing I was certain of was that I never wanted to step foot in that house again. Story 2. The Shadow on the Street. It was New Year's Eve and I was walking home at 3 a.m. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, and the cold night air seemed to hang heavy around me. I had just said goodbye to my friends who had decided to take a taxi home, but I was feeling stubborn. I lived in a safe neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing bad ever happens, and I convinced myself the walk would be fine. It wasn't too far and the night felt calm, at least at first. As I turned onto the main road that led to my street, I noticed something strange. A man was walking on the opposite side, his head down as if he was deep in thought. I didn't think much of it at first. It's not unusual to see someone out late, especially after New Year's Eve celebrations. But then, just as I glanced over again, he looked up at me, fast, like he had been waiting for me to notice him. His sudden attention sent a jolt through me, but I quickly looked away and kept walking. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe he was just another late-night walker heading home, just like me. But something about the way he moved felt off. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost like he wasn't in a rush to get anywhere. I could feel my heart beating faster as I kept walking, trying not to let my imagination get the best of me. That's all it was, I told myself. Just my imagination. Or so I thought. The further I walked, the heavier the air seemed to feel, like the quietness of the night was pressing down on me. The streets, which usually felt familiar, now seemed endless and foreign. The streetlights cast long shadows, and every little sound, leaves rustling, distant cars, made me jump. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone there, but the sidewalk was empty. I turned onto my street, trying to calm myself. This was my neighborhood, a place I had always felt safe. But as I walked past the small bakery on the corner, I couldn't help but glance back again. That's when I saw him, the same man. He wasn't far behind me now, walking at a steady pace, his face hidden into the shadows. My stomach dropped. How had he gotten so close so quickly? I hadn't heard his footsteps or seen him before now. My mind raced. Was he really following me, or was I just being paranoid? I tried to focus on getting home, quickening my pace, but not so much that it looked obvious. My hands felt clammy as I gripped my phone, debating whether to call someone. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his steps matched mine, like he was deliberately keeping the same distance. By the time I reached the middle of my street, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was almost home, but the distance felt so much farther than it usually did. The silence between his footsteps and mine was deafening, and I couldn't bring myself to look back again. I didn't want to see how close he was now. I just wanted to get to my house, to safety, as fast as I could. Finally, my driveway came into view. Relief washed over me as I quickened my pace, practically jogging up the path. The house was dark except for the porch light, and I could see my mom waiting by the front door. She must have stayed up for me. Something she often did when I came home late. Seeing her there made me feel safer, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that clung to me like a shadow I reached the porch and turned to look behind me for the first time in what felt like ages. The man was still there, walking down the street at the same deliberate pace. For a brief moment, it looked like he was about to step onto my driveway, and my heart stopped. But instead, he kept walking, his silhouette growing smaller as he moved past the house. I tried to convince myself he was just another passerby heading somewhere else. "Come inside," my mom said softly, holding the door open. I hurried in, feeling the warmth of the house wrap around me like a blanket. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax. I told Mom about the man I had seen, brushing it off as a strange coincidence, but her concerned expression made me second-guess my own word. Then she said something that froze me in place. "You don't have to leave the light on. Your brother came home 2 hours ago." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. I had left the light on because I thought Jonathan, my brother, was still out. But if he was already home, who had I just seen? And why did it feel like he'd been following me? I turned back toward the door, staring at the dark street beyond the porch light's glow. For the first time that night, I wondered if walking home alone had been a mistake I might not make it out of next time. Later that night, after changing into my pajamas, I decided to take a quick shower before bed. The house was quiet now, with my mom asleep and my brother in his room. I tried to push the unsettling walk home out of my mind, telling myself it was over. But as I stood under the warm water, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. Then I heard it, a faint noise coming from the bathroom window. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It was more like a faint, deliberate tapping, as if someone was pressing their hands against the glass. My heart began to race. I froze, listening intently. The noise came again, slightly louder this time. I reached up and turned off the shower, the sudden silence in the room amplifying every sound around me. I crouched down, my body trembling, too scared to look at the window. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was it the man from the street? Had he followed me here? I stayed like that for what felt like forever, crouched on the floor with the water dripping from my hair, listening to my own shallow breaths. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something. Small, faint blue lights, glowing in the darkness outside the frosted glass window. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but they moved, shifting slightly as if someone was adjusting their position. My chest tightened as I realized what they looked like. the keypad of a phone, glowing faintly in the dark. Someone was out there. My hands shook as I reached for the light switch, plunging the bathroom into darkness. I pressed myself into the corner, holding my breath, hoping they wouldn't see me. The lights continued to move, shining against the window like tiny ghostly eyes searching for me. I could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. After what felt like an eternity, the lights finally disappeared. I waited, too scared to move, my ears straining for any sound. Then, faintly, I heard it, footsteps moving away from the window, slow and deliberate, fading into the distance. But even as they grew quieter, I didn't feel safe. Whoever it was, they had been watching me, and for a terrifying moment, they had been just on the other side of the glass. Still trembling, I unlocked the bathroom door and ran straight to my parents' bedroom. My mom sat up instantly, startled by the look on my face. I struggled to explain what had happened, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "Someone was at the window," I whispered, my voice shaking. "They had a phone. I saw the lights." My dad, hearing the commotion, got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. "Stay here," he said firmly before heading outside. I clutched my towel tightly, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Mom held my hand, trying to calm me down, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that maybe I'd imagined it, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. Minutes passed like hours until Dad came back inside. His face was pale and his expression was serious. "I heard footsteps," he said quietly. "They were running down the path to gate the street, but whoever it was, they're gone now." His words sent a chill through me. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been there. Someone had followed me home, waited outside the house, and watched me through the bathroom window. The thought made my stomach churn. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every distant sound outside made me jump. Even when morning came, the fear didn't go away. I kept replaying the walk home in my mind, wondering if I could have done something differently. Should I have called someone sooner? Should I have asked my friends to stay with me? Now, years later, I still think about that night. I still wonder who that person was and what they wanted. I don't know if I'll ever have the answers, but I do know one thing. I'll never walk home alone at night again, because sometimes the streets aren't as empty as they seem. Story 3. The Gathering Lights. New Year's Eve in Zacapa, Mexico, always felt magical. The warm night air, the sound of distant music, and the glow of string lights hanging from balconies created a festive atmosphere that made you feel alive. My family had spent the evening at a party in an apartment building where we owned a small place. It was on the 4th floor, and from the terrace, you could see the entire town lit up as if the stars themselves had fallen to earth. There were about 35 people at the party, a mix of neighbors and friends, all laughing, talking, and enjoying the celebration. Around 11 p.m., as the clock ticked closer to midnight, one of my mom's friends wandered out onto the terrace and looked up at the sky. "That's strange," she said, her voice breaking through the chit-chatter inside. At first, no one paid much attention. It was New Year's Eve after all, and everyone was focused on the festivities. But then more people began stepping outside, their faces turned upward, staring. Curiosity got the better of me, and I joined them. When I looked up, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. At first, it just looked like stars, brighter than usual maybe, but still stars. Then I noticed something odd. These stars weren't where they were supposed to be, and they weren't acting like stars. They twinkled, but not in the soft, steady way you'd expect. It was erratic, almost like they were signaling something. More of them seemed to appear, clustering together, and the air around us grew quiet. No one said a word as we all stood there, staring at the sky. As more people joined us on the terrace, the murmurs began. "Are those planes?" someone asked, their voice uneasy. "Maybe a meteor shower?" another suggested. But deep down, I think we all knew this wasn't normal. The cluster of stars seemed too deliberate, too synchronized. They twinkled in an odd, almost mechanical way, and new lights were joining them from different parts of the sky, moving toward the cluster as if being summoned. I kept my eyes fixed on the strange gathering above, trying to make sense of it. The stars weren't just twinkling anymore. They were flickering, blinking in patterns that felt unnatural. A few of the kids giggled nervously, but most of the adults were silent, their faces tense. My mom stood beside me, gripping the edge of the terrace railing tightly. "What do you think it is?" I whispered to her, but she didn't answer. She just kept staring, her brow furrowed. The lights continued to move, more and more of them joining the cluster until there were too many to count. They were packed so closely together now that they formed what looked like a glowing mass in the sky. It was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once. Some people tried to take pictures or videos with their phones, but nothing seemed to show up. The lights were either too faint or too far away. Frustration mixed with fear as we realized there would be no proof of what we were seeing. Then, without warning, the massive lights began to shift. They weren't just hovering anymore. They were moving, slowly at first, but with purpose. A cold chill ran down my spine as I watched, the sense of wonder quickly replaced by a growing unease. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some natural phenomenon. It felt like it was watching us. The lights in the sky moved with a purpose that none of us could explain. They shifted together, almost as if they were connected. Like a school of fish gliding through water. Some of them blinked rapidly, while others stayed steady, forming strange patterns that seemed intentional. The unease among the group grew with every passing second. A man near me muttered, "This can't be real," as if saying it out loud would make it true. Then something changed. The cluster of lights began descending, just slightly, but enough for us to notice. A faint glow spread across the terrace, casting eerie shadows on the walls behind us. It wasn't bright enough to be overwhelming, but it was enough to make everyone tense. A woman near the back of the group gasped, pulling her child close. Someone else whispered, "Are they coming closer?" And the panic in their voice sent a shiver through me. People started to back away from the edge of the terrace, unsure of what to do. A few tried to laugh it off, but their nervous chuckles only made the silence feel heavier. "It's just a trick of the light," someone insisted. "Reflections or maybe drones." But the way their voice wavered made it clear they didn't believe their own words. The lights continued to move, forming a tighter, more defined cluster. Then, for a brief moment, they stopped completely, hovering in eerie stillness. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. That's when the beams appeared, thin, faint columns of light stretching down from the cluster, reaching toward the ground like searching fingers. They didn't touch us, but they were close, too close. I felt my mom's hand grip my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. "Get inside," someone shouted, breaking the silence. A few people scrambled back into the apartment, but most of us were frozen, unable to look away. The beams of light flickered and moved as if scanning the area, and the quiet hum that filled the air sent chills down my spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a random event. It felt deliberate, calculated, and every instinct in my body screamed that we were being watched. The beams of light continued their slow, deliberate movements, tracing across the terrace and the surrounding buildings. No one dared speak now. The only sounds were the faint hum in the air and the quiet, anxious breathing of the people around me. It felt like time had stopped, each second stretching out endlessly as we waited for whatever was going to happen next. Then, without warning, the lights began to move again. They shifted upward, away from us, but not in the erratic way you'd expect from something natural. It was smooth, controlled, and unsettlingly coordinated. The beams disappeared one by one, as if they'd served their purpose, leaving the sky eerily dark for a moment. Then the cluster of lights began to pulse, glowing brighter and dimmer in quick, rhythmic patterns. People started murmuring again, voices trembling with fear. "What are they doing?" someone asked, but no one had an answer. The pulsing lights became faster and more intense, casting strange shadows on the ground below. Then, in a sudden and breathtaking motion, the entire cluster streaked across the sky, leaving behind faint trails of light as they disappeared into the distance. It happened so quickly that it felt unreal, like a dream you're jolted awake from before you can make sense of it. For a moment, no one moved. We were all rooted to the spot, staring at the now empty sky. The hum was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that felt louder than any noise. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to process what had just happened. Someone finally broke the silence. "Did everyone see that?" they asked, their voice shaking. Heads nodded slowly, and a few people began speaking at once, their words tumbling over each other in a frantic attempt to make sense of it all. But no matter how much we talked, no one had any answers. The only thing we knew for certain was that whatever we had just witnessed, it wasn't normal, it wasn't explainable, and it wasn't something any of us would ever forget. The terrace buzzed with uneasy conversation as people tried to make sense of what had just happened. Some were adamant that it had to be a natural phenomenon, satellites, drones, or perhaps some kind of experimental aircraft. Others were less certain, their voices tinged with fear as they whispered about UFOs or something even stranger. My mom, usually calm and logical, was unusually quiet. She just stared at the sky, her hand still gripping my arm tightly. In the days that followed, the incident became the talk of the building. People swapped theories, trying to rationalize the impossible. A few even called local authorities or checked online for news, but there was nothing. No reports of strange lights, no scientific explanations, no confirmation that what we saw even happened. It was as if the entire event had been erased, existing only in our memories. One conversation stuck with me. The apartment owner's son mentioned that something similar had been seen in Zappa a year ago, also on New Year's Eve. I thought it was just a story, he admitted, his face pale. But now, I don't know. Maybe it's connected. The idea they sent a chill through me. Was this something that happened regularly? And if so, why here? Why us? Even now, years later, I still don't have answers. No one does. I've tried to forget about it, to convince myself it was nothing more than an unusual display of lights. But sometimes, when I look up at the night sky, I can't help but feel uneasy. I think about the way those lights moved, the way they seemed alive, purposeful, and I wonder, were we meant to see them, or were we simply unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain, that night changed the way I see the world. It reminded me how small and vulnerable we are, how much we still don't understand, and it left me with a question that I'm not sure I'll ever want the answer to. If they were watching us, what were they looking for?